Stay a while and listen.
This is the rather gruesome story of a phenomenon known as suicide murder. Suicide murder is basically wanting to commit suicide, but not wanting to do it yourself. And you then go out and you murder someone so you can be executed. Suicide murder is not very common today, but especially in the 18th century, a lot of suicide murders took place. Children were a common target for these suicide murders, and I will mention some examples, so you have been warned now. Take for example the story of a 30-year-old woman from Germany who on the 24th of May 1704 befriended a 7-year-old boy. They walked in the woods together and talked pleasantly, but after a while she threw the boy to the ground and slit his throat, saying, "May God protect you, you sweet angel, you are an angel before God." Later she said she believed the child was now saved and that she could leave the world as well. Or in Copenhagen in 1767, where Christian Olsen, a musketeer aged 50, could not pay his rent. He was in a strange mood and thought about killing himself, but instead he grabbed a 3-year-old child and stabbed him in the throat with his sword. Afterwards he handed himself in, claiming the devil had told him to commit a crime. 83 suicide murders happened in Copenhagen in the 18th century, which is almost one suicide murder each year. So what is going on here? Why did these persons, who were often depressed and tired of life, kill someone else so they could be sentenced to death? Why didn't they kill themselves, and how come children were often the target of these people? Now one factor is simply that they were Christians who believed in salvation and damnation. A Protestant Christian in the 18th century was very concerned whether or not he went to heaven or hell. If you killed yourself, you were certain of eternal damnation, and you were even denied a Christian burial. If you killed someone else, however, and then was condemned to be executed, you could still go to heaven. So even if you killed a child, you could still be saved if you repented. Another contributing factor was a narrative the murderers could build up around their sin and salvation. They could construct a grand narrative around their terrible murder, having been seduced by the devil to commit the deed. But with the intervention of God and the repentance that followed after their murder, they could achieve the salvation of their souls. A third factor was that the community and the authorities in Copenhagen initially met the suicide murderers with sympathy and understanding. Ballads, that is narrative poems, were commonly sold, having an actual suicide murderer as their protagonist. These ballads would basically echo that grand narrative of sin and salvation. The execution of the murderer was also a very public thing, placing the murderer in the center of a large amount of attention. Priests would accompany the murderer to the scaffold and stand by as they would be executed. It was then a pretty certain way for a depressed person to end his life and still find salvation, and to receive a lot of attention from his fellow human beings, who helped him in placing his life in a grander story. But why was children often the target of these people? Well, simply because they believed that children have sinned less, and thus were much more likely to go to heaven than an adult person they killed. If you have a worldview that says that this earthly life is simply a stepping stone to a more heavenly life, a better life, then a few things logically follow. It seems that people can just commit suicide and then come into heaven, so you must have a very strict rules concerning suicide. It must be something that God just abhors. So then that's why if you commit suicide, you go to hell. Because if there's no injunction against killing yourself, why not just kill yourself and then go to heaven and go to a much better place? But the child is not responsible for having been killed by someone else, and thus we can understand why someone may think that it is better to kill a child than an adult, since the innocent child will surely go to heaven. So it seems that we have at least somewhat grasped the mindset of a Christian in the 18th century, who goes out in the street and kills a child, so the person can be executed and achieve salvation. We have two deaths and two souls that goes to heaven and achieve salvation. But why was it that suicide murder was so common in the 18th century, but almost completely stopped after 1790? To understand why it stopped, we need to look at what the Danish government did to combat this problem, and their methods they used were copied sometimes in other places in Europe to deal with this problem. A decree in 1749 stated that the murderers should now be pinched with hot tongs, the right hand be chopped off with an axe, followed by decapitation. Afterwards the body would be set up on display on a post and wheel. Furthermore, the walk to the gallows would not be accompanied with any ceremony, but the murderer should rather be discreetly led to the place of execution. The standard practice before this was decapitation with a sword and burial in sacred ground. 11 suicide murders were punished according to this new decree, so it didn't really have so much as an effect that they had hoped. What really contributed to the end of the suicide murders was a decree proposed by Henrik Stampe. What he basically said that people want to be killed by doing this. So he proposed that we shouldn't kill people, we should just imprison them, and we should make them, every year we should make them go to the place where they have murdered someone and just be whipped there and just keep them alive to dissuade them from actually doing these suicide murders. Not killing a person who had committed a murder was actually quite revolutionary and could be rather controversial, since it rejected a biblical command. It is stated clearly in Exodus 21:12 that anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. This obviously applied to the suicide murder cases. It was thus in clear defiance of what is stated in the Mosaic Law Code that has a mandatory and divinely ordained death penalty for premeditated murder. This decree was put into effect in 1767, and while it didn't end suicide murders immediately, it made it a lot harder for a murderer to receive salvation. A person could no longer admit to doing a suicide murder, and if she wanted to be executed for the murder, had to lie to judges and priests for it not to appear like she wanted to get executed. Lying like this was not beneficial for one's salvation. So after 1790, the suicide murders started becoming very rare in Copenhagen. This was an end to a century of a very twisted logic that made people go out in the streets and kill innocent children so they could be executed themselves.